thank you for coming. Thanks so much. I'm here to take any questions.
What was your role in the filmmaking process exactly?
I wrote and directed it. Yeah. And it was developed, I went to NYU Film School for my master's. This was part of kind of my thesis. And it went through the writers and directors lab at Sundance. It's where it was developed. And then like 2 years after that, I shot it. It took 2 years to like get all the money together, because the money was like pieced together from every grant around the world, from France to the Netherlands to Sundance, and Kodak donated all the film and shot on film, a couple of angels, and a lot of crazy people who, we did a mostly local production, it's Iran, but shot in Lebanon. And then we had a deal where everyone got paid exactly the same amounts, from me to the grip, to the camera, to the actors, which was $100 a day. So, but luckily, a lot of people want to go to Beirut, so that was not that, we got a lot of great people. But the crew was from all over the world. Mostly the big part of the crew was from Lebanon, but other people came from France, Iran, the US, the Netherlands. So it was a very international group of folks.
What was it like shooting Lebanon for Iran?
I had shot a previous film in Iran, and we shot this right after the Green Wave, so I knew it was going to be kind of impossible to shoot any part of this in Iran. So I was sort of searching around. I travel a lot in the Middle East. I went to Turkey and Morocco and the Emirates, all the different places. But the second I landed, my mentor from the Sundance Labs, Adam Egoyan, his wife is Lebanese, and he suggested Lebanon. And the second I landed, I felt like I was in Iran. And I brought some friends who are artists from Iran to am I crazy, or just remind you of Iran? And they kept saying, I keep touching my head to see if my headscarf didn't fall off. I think partly because we look alike, first of all. And also because Iran had a war with Iraq, that lasted 8 years. Lebanon had the civil war, and so we always joke that the same developer redeveloped both countries. So it had a lot of the newer buildings juxtaposed with the older architecture. And this, I really was dedicated to shooting in the Middle East, because I wanted to have that feeling and the tensions that reside within those worlds. And not shoot it like in a house in LA or something, which we could have possibly done.
Have you shown this around the Middle East?
Yeah. Well, we can't officially. It showed officially in Turkey. It was very controversial because I allowed it to be showed in Israel. As you know, Israel and Lebanon don't get along. It had a lot of underground screenings in Lebanon. It was the #1 black market DVD in Iran, which is really funny because a lot of my family is super religious, and they were peddling this as the porn film, come get the sexy film, and I was like, can I get 5 cents for every one of those DVDs? And it had millions of downloads, it's hilarious, illegal downloads, and which I think is always awesome. And I get, so many, even now I still get tons of messages from people from Iran. So it's cool how you can make a film about making illegal films legally, and then it gets filtered back, through the digital mediums and goes back into that world. It's like meta storytelling. But there's been a lot of private screenings in the Middle East, but because of the sexuality and because of religion, it's kind of a difficult one to officially show. I was sad that they couldn't officially show this in Lebanon, which was a bummer.
And is it changing now, how you, I imagine when you see it now and it's responded to here now, has it changed over the last 6-7 years? Are people interested in Iran in a different way, or?
I think, the interest is, it's interesting that, this was made right after the Green Wave, before the Arab Spring. So actually when the film was at Sundance is right when the Arab Spring happened. So it's interesting. It's a lot about people trying to create change through art, and that sort of momentum when I showed it was really exciting. And then, knowing what's happened since then has been, it gives it a different sort of weight in terms of, coming from that world, and what does change mean, and how does art fit into that, given the situation throughout the Middle East at the moment. I think also as a filmmaker, it's, you know, you don't own anything that you make. It's to the audience. And I find it interesting, like when we showed it at Outfest, there were so many people that came up to me from all over the world who felt like this was their story, you know, from Guatemala or from, you know, Vietnam, or it was interesting, like they felt like this somehow reflected their story, which I find is fascinating, you know, be it male or female or gay or straight, they felt some sort of connection. But a lot of queer folk from different parts of the world really connected to the film, which I found fascinating. Then again, then you have those people who are like, I love the movie because it just shows how backwards Iran is. I'm like, I think you missed the point of the movie. You know, but you don't, then again, you don't own the film, and you have to understand that people have different interpretations, no matter what your politics are.
Yeah.
People always bring their own into the film. So that's something that's sometimes hard for me to navigate. Because even within the Iranian community, it was insanely controversial. Like, so we showed for months in the cinema, for instance, in Los Angeles, at the Landmark and the ArcLight, which was, for me as a filmmaker, a dream come true. But there was a lot of, like, I did a couple of Q&As, and at the time I was 9 months pregnant doing these Q&As. I was like, ginormous. And there would be like fist fights breaking out in the Q&As and amongst the Iranian folks. You know, people would jump up and say, this is authentic. And someone else would say, this is bullshit, doesn't show Iran, and you're trying to show Iran in a bad way. And this whole idea of representation, which I think is fascinating, you know, who gets to represent? What does it even mean to represent a whole country or a whole subset of a country in one piece of work? I mean, you only work from your own story or from your own experience, but there's such a projection that this represents your country, or this represents gay people, or this represents whatever it is for people. So it caused a lot of passion, a lot of fights. There was like insane fights breaking out when I was in LA and Chicago, which I think is great as a filmmaker. You don't want people to be, it's great that they engage with the work. I appreciate Iranians, like even if they don't agree with you, they come to the film to tell you what you did wrong. And I always say, that's awesome. I can't wait to see I hope you go and, you know, if you don't feel it doesn't reflect your life, that you make something. You don't have to be a filmmaker. Maybe you write an article, or maybe it's painting, or whatever that is. I'm only coming it from my experience. And my experience is unusual because I grew up between both countries. My parents didn't come here during the revolution. They came before the revolution. So I spent a lot of my childhood. I moved back to Iran when I was in second grade. I was there while the country was becoming Islamicized. My interaction between the two countries is kind of inside out. I don't really belong in either place. You know, it's funny. I used to get rejected in Iran because I was American, and I would come back from living in Iran, and I'd get beat up for being Iranian. I'm like, I can't win here. But yeah, so I think my perspective, both on American culture and Iranian culture, is unusual, since I'm someone who's lived back and forth.
Yeah, and the conflict seems to be a testament to the complexity of the characters too. I mean, they're so surprising, and you know, they can't be reduced.
Well, yeah, it's kind of my own spin, I think, on the Iranian American characters, my own spin on those worlds, because like as a teenager I would go back to Iran, and my cousins who lived there, they would take me to all these underground parties. And it's funny because my parents in America are super religious, but I would go to Iran and they let me do anything I wanted in Iran, because Iran was like an Islamic republic, right? What kind of problems could she run into? And she had no idea, because in America, growing up in the 80s and 90s in New York, it's like, my dad was a doctor, he worked for low-income people, he had a clinic in Bed-Stuy, he was a huge idealist, and he was religious. And I never did any of the drugs or anything in America, and I would go to Iran and it was like wild parties and like underground shit, and I mean stuff that I never saw because I was not allowed to go to those things in America. Yeah. But I saw it all in Iran, so it was interesting, and my parents had no idea what they were letting me do. They're like, oh, she's with her cousins, she's fine,
There's some questions up there.
It's really great piece of work. Thank you for bringing it up. May I know what's the budget, and how do you get the budget?
What's the budget?
How do you get the permission to shoot in those religious places? Right,
yeah. Well, I always like to say the budget's like more than $5 and less than $1 million. No, but it was under $500,000. So it's considered low budget. Most of the money came from, I'd say 50% came from grants. So I won the French government grant, the fund sued. I won the Hubert Balls from the Netherlands. I won every single grant ever made in America for film. Women in Film, I don't know, Sundance Institute, the Adrian Shelley Award. Oh my God, I can't remember how many awards. A lot of people supported me. And then the rest were just a couple of investors that gave small amounts. And then the last investor, when we got into Sundance, brought the money so that we could finish the film. But everything was donated, like the sound designer, the people that did Star Wars and like all these huge films. And it was really hilarious because they saw, we sent a teaser, like we were basically needing people to donate their services. We didn't have enough money to finish the film to bring it to Sundance. So I brought a teaser to all the top places in LA, like literally they do Star Wars, these huge films. So, you know, the people that did the color correct do all these commercials, and I wasn't even in the meeting, they were weeping, I don't know, they had a teenage daughter, they related to it. And the people that did the sound, they were like, we'll donate it, you know, for the film. It's kind of like advertising at Sundance. And they like to do indie films because they do huge films, they do Game of Thrones, you know, they do these huge things. So I was so excited, it's like Todd A.O., it's like a filmmaker's dream. So I go, and at the time I was staying in Pasadena, which is super far from Santa Monica, so I would get up at like 6 in the morning. I didn't want to miss a minute, so I would get there, you know, there's a lot of traffic in LA, so I would get there early and just sleep in the parking lot until it was like time to go in. And I remember the first day I go in and I say, they have like a barista. Like, oh, hey, I'd like a cappuccino and a muffin. And she's like, oh, I'm so sorry. We don't give cappuccinos to the runners, to the assistants. And I was like, oh, no. No, my film is mixing in like Studio 2. She said, oh, I'm sorry, we've never had a woman here. Wow. We've never had a woman filmmaker. I'm like, oh, yeah, I swear it's mine. I can prove it. Can I have a cappuccino? But yeah, we just had a lot of amazing people, you know, supporting the film. And then it got, when we went to Sundance, yeah, we had a lot of different companies offering to buy the film. So we sold it to Participant and Roadside. Roadside distributed Manchester by the Sea this year, and Participant, this was their first foreign language film. They had done like, I don't know, you know, Participant, they do a lot of those like socially minded films.
It's Jeff Skoll.
And Jeff Skoll, and Inconvenient Truth, and anything with the social message.
Yeah.
So it was exciting to be able to sell it. I had no expectations. I'm like, it's a foreign language gay film. 6 people will see it. It'll be awesome. But yeah, then it sold to 13 countries, and I got to travel and like present the film in different countries for the theatrical release, which was fun. Go for
Up top.
So how did you come up with the idea, the script? And then what was the process like from its conception up until screening, getting actors?
Well, I had made 2 films I was talking about earlier that had I made while I was in film school. And one was a feature doc that I shot in Iran that ended up actually supporting me for so many years. It sold to television all through Europe, and it was called The Color of Love. And that was like 3 stories of love, 3 different generations. And then I made a love triangle film short that also went to Berlin and won the Teddy like 2 years later. And that was shot in Argentina. I used to live in Argentina. I told you I studied at the University of Buenos Aires. And so I like to say it's kind of like those 2 ideas smashed together. I have no idea where stories come from. I think probably part of it is, I had a professor at NYU. This is hilarious. You will love the story. So I had this, Hampton Francher. He wrote Blade Runner. He was one of the co-writers of Blade Runner. And he came to see my doc when it showed at the MoMA, and he didn't, you don't really know your students that well. He saw the film, and he was so like supportive. It was, I love him. The first day of class when he came to teach, he stripped down completely naked, and he sat in front of the room, and he said, "Writing is about being vulnerable, right?" And it's like the most hilarious thing. And then, so he came to my film, and then we had to write 2 scripts as part of the class. And so he said, "Oh, I want you to come to my apartment," and whatever. So he had all this cool paraphernalia. And he said, "Oh, Maryam, I read your scripts. They're really, really well written, but they're absolute bullshit." And I was like, "Ouch, that hurts." He's like, I've gotten to know you over the course of this class, and I feel like you don't write nothing about you or your life experiences in these screenplays. And I'm not saying you should write something autobiographical, but you should write something that resonates with your life experience. So give it a try. So then that was the very first rendition of this script, and this was originally 3 different stories in 3 countries. So the first story, which was only 25 pages of the script, was this story. And I took it, went to Tribeca and then to Sundance, and everyone kept saying, oh, those other stories are great, but we really want to know more about these families. And when I would tell them what happened, the backstories, they're like, that should be the film. The film is the family dynamic. So that's how it started. It was literally like a short part of a bigger project, and then people responded to that. And just through the process of people asking questions about the characters, I started to fill in what their story was. And then everyone would say, well, that's the story. I'm like, what do you mean? That's just their backstory. And they're like, no, that's the story. So it was to strip away all the other stuff and just focus on these 4 main characters: the father, the daughter, the brother, and the best friend. So, and the father is loosely based on my uncle, who actually was doing his PhD at UMass, and then went back during the revolution, and was very liberal. And he was a liberal guy who ended up getting stuck in Iran after the revolution. So just kind of conflating a bunch of stuff. I come from a big family, and I have a twin brother, so we were always vying for the same girls and boys in our class. So there was always a love triangle going on when you have a twin brother. Yeah, but I don't know if there's any straight line, but I think I tried to do something that resonated a bit with what my life experience was on some level, but not be autobiographical, because my family will kill me.
So, I caught your film in the winter when I was visiting my parents, and I should say they're both from Iran. They were born and raised in Tehran. And I can't imagine a more uncomfortable and tragic screening that I'll ever see again.
With your parents?
Yes, of certain things.
You have to wait till you saw the screen with my mom at Sundance. I can tell you about that.
I didn't.
What was it?
Well, seeing this film, I think we all have this fondness for Iranian cinema because it's something that ties us to the culture that we reproduce and continue at home, and that for me and my siblings we inherit. But there was something tragic about watching this film, and it spoke to me about the impossibility of inheriting or reproducing an authenticity in a diaspora. Watching this film where the scene is not at all recognizably Iranian, set in Lebanon, on streets where instead of pecans and Kia Prides and beaten up, junkers, you have BMWs and Hummers and this and that.
Have you been to Iran lately?
Yes, but not everyone has a BMW or a Hummer.
Right, but that's the characters of the film.
That's true. I mean, that's.
But again, it's what do you want to represent? It's right. It doesn't.
Society.
So does it not exist if it's only 1%?
It exists, but it's a privileged narrative that's seen everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Who leaves Iran after the revolution? Who leaves before the revolution? Prior to the revolution, those who were leaving Iran were the technocrats, people who had access to academia abroad or the state apparatus in Iran and abroad. Those who left after were the ones who had the wealth and mobility to do that, who had the channels to sell everything and get out through smugglers.
Well, that's a very simplistic. Okay. I mean, there's lots of, my family doesn't fit into either of those categories. That's the thing, you can't make stories. I mean, for me, I think any story is from your own personal experience. That doesn't seem real to you because it's not your experience. But it's my family doesn't fall into those categories that you just said. My family was neither a technocrat, nor were they privileged. So how do they fall into your narrative? You're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that came, and if they don't fit into your narrative, it's not authentic.
That's true, but Iranian Americans are the most wealthy minority in the country. There's no question about that. Wealthiest and most educated.
Okay, and your point
most
is?
degree holding. Iran has experienced the most severe brain drain of any country in the world. There's been, a systematic removal of people who have degrees, what have you, of an incentivizing of this drain throughout the world. And, you know, I mean, these people can't help it, of course. You know, if they can live a better life elsewhere, they will. And that's what my parents did. They, when the universities left, or shut down, they left so they could study elsewhere, and I don't blame them for it. But generationally, this is the trend.
But
So
what
people-
about someone who doesn't fit into that? What about my family who went back to Iran after the revolution? You're talking about people who left. My family is an anomaly. Half of my family went back to Iran. They were studying in America, and they went back to Iran. So not every narrative fits within, you know, your specific experience, and that's the point of any story. It's like it should be relevant to you, and like I think that's what's interesting when people ask like, oh, it's impossible, or it's not authentic, or there's BMWs. It's like that's your experience of that space, and it's not necessarily everyone's experience, and nor should you try to make something like what film represents America, what film represents New York. I mean, is it Spike Lee? Is it Scorsese? Is it like Sofia Coppola? I mean, what represents anything? Like, I think any piece of art, and this is where we go beyond, you're giving me a social history of Iran, which is in and of itself, like, filtered through your experience. Like, any piece of art is the personal experience of the director. I think if you're an auteur, if you're a writer, director particularly, you filter what you write through your own life experiences, through your own point of view. Like, my point of view is going to be extremely different than his. He's a man, I'm a woman, I spent my life back and forth. My family's economics, the fact that my family's from Shiraz, and only part of my, you know, like every aspect of how we interact with the world affects, you know, how we see it. And I think that's what is exciting about independent cinema internationally, is that it's filtered through the experience of the individual. Even Iranian cinema, again, coming from Iran, is also filtered through the state, because most of the money that comes into Iranian cinema has to be approved by the state. So again, you have another filtration of what stories get told. So I think it's fascinating in a world where you can make a film outside of the country. It's fascinating in a world where you can bring people from all of the diaspora. Like, you know, the film had people, you know, the older characters had studied at the University of Tehran, and they were all acting students. And the guy who plays the father is a very famous theater director in Toronto. And he was helping me cast, and through the casting process, I asked him to be the father. And I said, you know, who can you recommend? And he recommended Susan Taslimi, who's like a very, very famous Iranian actress who left in the 90s and now lives in Sweden. And she couldn't do it, so she recommended her friends. But it ended up being that all those older folks, they had gone to the same university in Tehran, and they had left Iran at different points. So the father left in 1979. The woman who plays his wife didn't leave till the 90s. She'd worked in Iran doing tons of TV and film. The guy who plays the head of the secret police didn't leave until 15 years ago. And they had all worked in Iran at different periods. And I thought what was so fascinating about the process was that you had this group of people that were friends in college and hadn't seen each other since the revolution. And so them coming together in Lebanon for the first day of like readings was the most emotional, amazing experience. And it did speak to the diaspora. It is a different point of view. And the fact that they came and helped the other actors who, like, you know, Sarah spent a lot of time in Iran, but she grew up in Paris, and the other girl grew up in Canada. Reza, the brother, lived in Iran. He didn't move here till he was 17. So it was just interesting, their interaction, both generationally and by class, because they came from different classes. And it was a fascinating, like, microcosm of a diaspora that comes together to make a piece of art that spoke to that. You know, and I thought, to me, that was really powerful. And we brought, you know, people from Iran to do production design. And so it really was a different perspective, you know, and it was really exciting to me because it's a question of authenticity. It's like, are you authentic because you lived outside? Well, am I authentically American? I was just detained coming to America recently for hours, like at JFK Airport, because they kept saying, what brings you to America? I'm like, I'm born in America. But they were assuming that I'm, you know, my name, whatever it was, I was not American. And they kept questioning me, like, you know, why did your parents come to me? All these things. So it's your question for being an American, your question for being an Iranian. It's an interesting question. What does it mean to be from a nation, especially when you're from two nations that are at opposing ends? So it's a constant question of authenticity, or even like within the queer space, you know. I remember when I was first writing this film, my father was really religious. I mean, he passed away years ago, and he was like, "What makes you think you can represent Iran?" And that was like, you know, really hard for me when I made The Color of Love, which I shot all in Shiraz, with all these different a lot of my family members. And he said, why do you think you can go back and make this film? What gives you the right to do that? It's a good question. But, you know, if we wait for people to tell us we have the right to do anything, we'll never make anything. And especially, you know, as a female director, fuck it. I'm going to make it because I want to. You know, I don't need anyone to tell me I'm authentic. I don't need anyone to tell me it's right or wrong. It's my own perspective. So, anyway.
Yeah, Dana.
Yeah, how long was like the script making process and the filming process? Like how long was this? I don't know if you answered this during
The script writing? So I think the first draft I wrote probably, actually I wrote the first draft while I was in my last year of school, so like 2007. So I had a short at Berlin, and then a friend of mine saw it and gave it to the people at Sundance, and they were like, "What are you working on?" I said, "I'm working on the script." And I sent them the first draft. It didn't get in to the labs. And then I reapplied the next year. And they said, you know, they brought me to the lab. So that's now we're a year and a half in. And they said you should focus on the one story. So I think that script development was like 2.5 years of script writing. And then this, you know, the filmmaking is very short. You have 22 days to shoot the film. But we had very, very little money. So, and I was like, okay, this is where I want to shoot it. So I went to Lebanon, and I'm not Lebanese, but I had a really good friend, I told you, from film school, who I called her on Friday, and I said, I want to come to Lebanon. And she said, well, I'm leaving next week. If you want to come, like now. So I literally got on a plane. I had some money, like I had a travel grant from Sundance. So I went, and I was like, can you introduce me to everybody who works in film? And then, you know, there was only a couple of Lebanese filmmakers that are well known. So I literally sat in this one cafe. To this day, people know me in that cafe, Cafe Yunus in Hamra. And I just like sat and I met every single person who's ever touched film, looked at film, thought about film, worked in advertising. And the thing is, it's a dangerous thing. In Lebanon, we had to have a fake script, and it had to go through the censorship board. It's not like it was easy to shoot in Lebanon, you know. But I had to find the people I trusted, you know. And then there's this woman that I met who does Nadine Labaki's films. I don't know if you know Nadine Labaki. She did Caramel, and she's had a couple of really amazing comedies. I've been at Cannes and stuff. So one of her casting director people, I sat with her, and she's just the biggest badass I've ever met, right? And I was like, I really wanted to impress her. Her dad is this famous Elias Houri. I think he's at NYU. You know him, totally, right? So that's her dad. So amazing political activist and a scholar. So I gave her the script, and I'm like, I'm leaving tomorrow, you know, give it a read, blah, blah. So I go back to my hotel, and I get a call like 2 hours later. She's like, Maryam, I need to see you right now. I'm like, okay. So I get, and I go, and I sit with her, and she starts bawling her eyes out. I'm like, is everything okay? What happened? She's like, this is literally my story. This literally happened to me, like my girlfriend, and lives in Canada now. Like this whole story, that how it relates to her life. And she's like, we gotta make this movie. And I was like, okay. And then, you know, we got the money together, and I was like, she never forgot, you know, she stood by the project. And I came back, and I literally would go from location to, we would find these locations with some friends of mine who were like DJs. And we would go and like just sit down with the homeowner with some tea, and I'd show them my documentary, The Color of Love, and I'd say, I'm making this film, and we would love to use your house for free, you know. So just like go location to location, and we got like all of these locations for like $3,000, and this is like the Sursak mansion. It's like the most famous mansion, and
oh wow,
you know, we saw that in the Sursak mansion. And anyway, we shot at all these different places, and I sat down with so many people. And it was so amazing because, you know, in what world do you get to hang out in Lebanon, in a culture that's similar but not the same, but get to tell people about what you want to do and why you want to do it, and then they're invested in the crazy idea, and then they let you do it. You know, it's such a cool it's such an amazing process to know that, you know, people also want to be connected to some other stories, you know, even if it's not their own, even if it feels familiar. And I'm so thankful that so many people, you know, took a crazy plunge with me and had a lot of teas with me. But yeah, I mean, I think your first films are always unusual. I think, you know, my next film is difficult in a different way. It's much, much bigger. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an ongoing process. But I think, you know, just be passionate and crazy and like unrelenting. And there's always naysayers that say you can't do it, you shouldn't do it, or, you know, do you have the right to do it? And you have to say, fuck it, yeah, I do actually. So I'm going to do it. And it was just an exceptional process and filmmaking is not like writing a novel. It's so many people involved. I mean, just the crew is like 60 people. The post-production is another 30 people. The distributors is another 20 people in each country, you know, and the PR. I mean, there's just so many people involved just to make a film that most people would just watch on their iPhones anyway. But it's cool, you know, it's like, hey, why not? You know, they get to experience it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's part insanity.
Yeah.
And the rest is just like a very clear belief in what you're doing. Because it is a crazy path, you know. I did go to Lebanon. I'm like, how did I do that? But
do you have another question? We should wrap up in a few minutes if anybody else.
I mean, I appreciate your bucket attitude, but given the hegemonic understandings of queer sexualities and gender identities in Iran, given that there's all this like literal propaganda about how it's, you know, this sort of Western bourgeois influence and all that, don't you have an ethical responsibility to portray it as not necessarily this bourgeois westernized thing? Because lots of queer people in Iran, their stories are untold because it's sort of smothered by these perceptions that have been produced by a film like this. That queer people are the wealthy, posh ones who have the privilege to sort of, you know, explore their sexuality through lavish underground parties, when these kinds of venues don't exist. When a party in Iran is like 30 or 40, 20-somethings with a bag of chips and like 3 bottles of liquor.
okay, well, that's your experience. I've been to many huge parties in Shiraz that are like insane in like old houses. I mean, I've been to parties that have hundreds and hundreds of people. So do they not exist?
Dancers?
Excuse me?
With go-go dancers and shit?
Well, there's dancers, but not like necessarily like that. But that's my own interpretation of that
It's a film.
space.
It is a film, but we have the entire United States military apparatus pointed at Iran.
So is that my responsibility? First of all,
Yes, you bear an ethical responsibility.
no, I bear a responsibility to tell a story, one particular story, and you're denying that the fact that, first of all, the 2 girls come from 2 completely different economic backgrounds. Do you even know that they're, you know, just because you go to a wealthy school doesn't necessarily mean that you're wealthy? I mean, that's part of the story. Part of the story is that one of the girls is, you know, overcome by circumstance. And also, I'm sorry, I'm not going to, my job is not to think about the political apparatus of the world. The reality is women, this is a film about women's sexuality, and I'm really sad that you find it to be about you only see it through one particular lens, which is your own. This is actually, contrary to what you say, has affected thousands of people have messaged me from Iran, from all over the world, especially women, especially queer people, and they feel that they identify, and this is a very unusual undertaking to have a film that even expresses female sexuality in any way. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to repress what my vision of that world is to whatever it is that your agenda is, because that's not truthful to who I am. And if you feel like you want to make something else, then you have the privilege to do that. You know, that's the thing. Everyone has the privilege to create work that resonates with them. But you don't have the privilege, you don't have the right to tell someone that their work needs to represent something, or that the onus is on one particular filmmaker. I would love to see 50 queer stories coming out of Iran, 100 about every aspect of Iranian culture, and it does come out. it's coming out, and there's lots of underground films happening in Iran. There's lots of underground theater happening in Iran. I mean, I hope to see more, and I hope if you feel like it's not like reflecting your experience, that you make your own work. But I've had lots of people tell me to the contrary, and that's not my point as a filmmaker. It's not what's important to me that it resonates with every single person. Then I would be actually quite disturbed if I made something that resonated with everybody, because that's not reality. You know, my reality is not your reality. So.
Yeah, Brian.
Thank you very much for your film. I think for our students, you might have said something, because I'll be running in now, about the involvement of the Sundance apparatus in the making of the film, and to what extent things like some of the questions that have been raised by our students about sort of the lens, the which social class, and what kind of imagery and what kind of portrayal of sexuality. Does the Sundance, what was the collaboration like with them over the period?
I mean, they're looking at trying to tell the story that you want to tell, and it's not focused in the ways that you're suggesting. I think for me it was something very difficult, because I've spent my whole life back and forth, and even to write something like this is hard. I mean, especially coming from a super religious family, and and the ramifications for me personally after this film was huge. So I think it was for me to overcome like a lot of my own internal barriers to even make it. I think as artists we are, and especially as women, we're constantly told to self-censor and to not pursue what's truthful to us because of so many different agendas. And I think what the Sundance Institute tries to do is to say, what is your truth? And a lot of people coming from very non-traditional backgrounds, not even necessarily, I mean, I was doing academia before I ever went into film, and in fact, I find it ironic that you make all those statements, because one of the reasons I went into film was in the post 9/11 world. I thought, I felt completely left out of the narrative, and I felt, resonating my experiences growing up in New York in the 80s, after the hostage crisis and what my family went through at that period. I felt like, okay, I have to continue down a path to make stuff into the greater landscape that resonates with something that I can identify with. I love Iranian cinema. It was a huge influence. I went to school at Northwestern, and the Art Institute of Chicago was the first place to bring films from Iran and to bring the filmmakers while I was a student. And that was hugely influential for me, just to see those films and talk to the filmmakers and just see something that we longed for, images out of that country, be it even though they were filtered they're funded through the state system. But then I was like, that's amazing, but that doesn't resonate to me, So going down a path that resonates to the filmmakers, and a lot of people coming from completely non-traditional backgrounds, and I think, making a film that depicts queer sexuality in any way, or female sexuality in an Islamic context, is a very difficult process as a woman, as a filmmaker, coming from a certain type of family. Like, it was just to really do something that resonated with my life experience, to do something that I felt was particularly only my vision. Like, I could be the only person who made this particular film with those particular embellishments, And that's the great thing about cinema. It's like you can embellish things, you can change something, you can have aspects of reality and distort them. You can, you have so much to play with, even with this idea of, is it literal surveillance, or is it a metaphor for surveillance? I mean, what does it mean to be watched? What does it mean to be in a state where people constantly feel watched? How does that resonate with America? So much of this for me was like in a post-Bush era. I was coming at it from my own perspective as someone growing up here as after the invasion of Iraq, and just feeling like as activists we were being watched. So all of these back and forths, they're very much a reflection of my life, both in Iran and in America. So I think, the injection of the character of Hossein, like an Iranian American who wants to create change in the most naive of ways. Like, that's me on some level, you know? It's like, it's true. You know, we are naive on some level because we come from a culture, our parents have come and gone back and forth, but they've preserved a sense of identity, you know, for us. And it's like this longing to go back to a place that doesn't really exist on some level. Like my parents left in 1967, and they went back and forth, but even the type of Farsi I speak from Shiraz, it's like, when I met Asghar Farhadi, he would laugh, because he's like, you speak like an old lady. Literally, because the language has been preserved so much from that era. You know, it's such a, you know, immigrants come and they want to preserve a sense of where they're from, and that means a lot of times freezing it and not letting it evolve over time. But yeah, so anyway, that's just to say that I think a lot of these programs, their agenda is not to have an agenda. Their agenda is to allow a space where someone can explore without feeling afraid. And I think as anyone who writes, you know, I wrote a series, I'm about to shoot my next film, I do a lot of writing. Maybe I'm primarily a writer. But, you know, the writing process is something about overcoming the self and you know, being vulnerable, like Hampton said, like being naked. And, you know, someone might say you know, this part of you is unattractive or whatever it is, but it's you know? So it's like you got to embrace that. That's why I say, fuck it, because it's your experience and you got to go with what's authentic to you. And everything else, you know.
Do you want to mention just what you're working on now, like the next couple of big projects? Because you have a lot.
Yeah, God, what am I working on? I'm about to shoot a film very soon. So I just came back from shooting a TV show I directed, and then I am having a new film starring Susan Sarandon this summer, a big political thriller. I have a TV show for BBC America about the, God, what would happen in America if a fascist state took over? Oh wait, that's already happened. And yeah, I have a couple other projects with Amazon that I'm working on.
Nice.
So slowly, it's so easy as a woman in the industry, so I figured, you know, all six of us. I mean, it's not even a joke. I mean, it's interesting, like being a woman and being Middle Eastern, all these things are like obstacles on every level to overcome. And I think if you allow people or, you know, other people's opinions of what you should do get in the way, I think it's crushing. I think it's really already the chips are stacked against you. You have to have, like I said, you have to have a clear vision of who you are and what you're about. And, you know, you can only speak from your own perspective.
Yeah. Well, we should wrap it up. You want to have one last question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, like, when you're starting with making film, how do you make a living?
How do you make a living? Good question. I personally was very lucky because, like, my first year project at NYU, I was joking, like, so my first year, the head of the department was a doc filmmaker, and while I was in Iran making it was supposed to be a short doc, the US invaded Iraq. And so I called the head of my department and I said, you know, I really want to stay. I really feel like I want to stay and make a longer piece. And so that piece was The Color of Love. And that ended up selling to so many places that I was able to live on that for so many years, which I was super lucky. It's a lot of piecing things together. Now I'm at a place where I don't need to do that at all. Like, you know, I make a living through my writing, through selling of TV shows or directing on other shows. I think it's difficult. It's definitely challenging. I think in the beginning I did a lot of advertising, and I did a lot of script writing. It's called ghostwriting or script revisions on horrible Hollywood films with racist Middle Eastern characters. But I did a lot of different writing jobs to make a living. But now I luckily don't have to do that anymore. I think a lot of people teach.
Yeah.
Definitely teach. What else do people do? Advertising or
Make
commercials, make art.
Yeah.
Marry wealthy. Live very minimally.
Yeah.
I think my greatest asset is I grew up my God, my dad was like doing social medicine for the poor in Bed-Stuy. We grew up, I had 7 brothers. We grew up with very, very little money. And that's been a helpful lesson to learn, I think, growing up. I was lucky. I also don't have any student loans because I won a full scholarship to go to NYU. I always only went to schools that gave me full scholarships. Even though I would have wanted to go to other schools, but I was all about never being in debt.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big thing because my partner now is in a lot of debt. I think it's hard, I think, to do what we do and to be in debt. It's so funny. I'm on the alumni board for for NYU, and whenever there's someone from the Middle East, they're like, call Maryam, she'll tell them. And I don't know if they know, but I always say, don't come. No, I say, I'm not joking, I say, okay, are you on scholarship? No. Are you from a wealthy family? No. Okay, you realize you're gonna have to pay this back for the rest of your life. I mean, think about going to a state school. There's a lot of great state schools that you can get a great film education. And I mean, you don't even need to go to school to do film, honestly. I just hate to see that people get $200,000 in debt, and then it's nearly impossible to work if you have to pay $3,000 a month in student loans. It's hard.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing is, there's amazing films being made for so little. You just have to have the ability to not be tethered to insane real life issues like student loans, which suck. I don't recommend it. But I think, it's a difficult process. I think a lot of people in my world, they direct on TV to make a living. That's the most common thing. People do TV directing work. So, or we strike like we did this week, try to get more money with writing. Yeah.
Screenwriters.
Yeah. The Writers Guild.
The Writers Guild.
Yeah. It's challenging, and it's even more challenging as a woman because I think it's less than 5% representation in the industry, and then add minorities, you're down to negative 10%. It's definitely challenging. I think the most important thing in film is to find your advocates, to find people that believe in what you do, and we help each other. When I get a job and I can't do it, I give it to other people. I try to always recommend a woman or try to recommend minorities over anyone else. So my first TV directing job was Ava DuVernay, who we were did Selma and all these great films, but our first films were bought by the same distributor, and we stayed friends, and she only hires women. It's incredible.
Yeah.
It's no women get hired in TV directing. It's I think it's less than 2%. And she only hires women. She'll only hire female directors because she's trying to reverse the trend. And I think this is how you can do it. I learned so much being on that set because she hires mostly minorities and women and gives them a chance. And when I make my next film, I'm going to do that. It's the only way to make change is to actually do it. What we're doing on the next levels of our careers to put, to really pay that forward in terms of who we hire is the most important thing to create diversity.
Yeah, it's not only the vision of making the film, but how to shape the whole industry around it.
How to shape the person that gets the opportunity to do every job on your crew.
Yeah.
Who do you bring? And, I find what's fascinating with Ava is that she brings people who were seconds and brings them to firsts, so she gives people one-step opportunity to bump up. And that's something very hard in our industry also, to move beyond where you started. So I think it's an important thing that, as I move forward in my career, that I'm very dedicated to doing. I mean, I mentor a lot through all the different nonprofits, and I do a lot of workshops and stuff, but I really feel the number one thing you can do is who you hire, who you pay, and try to bring people up with you. So.
Well, thank you, Maryam.